like to comment about today, speaking about Zionism, about whether there's possible, especially in the Christian world, if the enemy's proximate to Israel, largely in the Islamic world, if she sees any theological resources that might strengthen Zionism. This has been sort of a relatively new phenomenon in the last, say, in the 20th century. Or is it better to construct the argument completely on secular grounds?
Thank you. Well, I guess that's kind of a personal question which I won't answer. But I will say that there is considerable debate in Christian circles. You have different denominations.
Just speak a bit louder, I think, that you can't hear me.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's about as good as I can do. There are a number of different perspectives in the Christian world, and there are, as you know, so many different Christian denominations, and a variety of different perspectives. You have such a phenomenon as Christian Zionism, which you may be referring to, which I think is a very popular point of view in the evangelical community in the United States, and it is a very powerful movement. They raise a lot of money for Israel, and they do a lot of charitable work in Israel. But there are there are other Christian groups. The United Church is one in Canada, which has extremely recently come out condemning Christian Zionism as a false doctrine. So and calling for active resistance on the part of their congregations. So there is considerable debate. The role that Christians will play in defending Israel and defending Zionism is something that different denominations are arguing over. I do see that as the future, quite frankly. I see that there is going to be enormous debate in the different denominations, and this one I think could actually get quite ugly in Canada as well.
Was that alarm just to be ignored? Is that a customary thing here that went off? Or? Okay. If you're all serene, I'll remain serene. I'd like to ask a question of Professor Hirsch, and then you can respond, in fact, to the first question as well. You mentioned in the social circles that you move in, there's a kind of an acceptable anti-Semitism, or not to say, I should talk with your friends, I mean, the chattering classes and so forth. Given your observation that anti-Semitism can have an allure for those who are, say, fighting for the little guy against the powerful elites, why would it then be an attractive view for those precisely who are in a privileged position?
I just wanted to come back on the previous question first, which I thought was very interesting, because the question was, are there theological resources which can bolster Zionism, yes? Now, from my point of view, I think we need to make a distinction, right? I'm interested in, the thing that worries me is anti-Semitism. Now, anti-Semitism often comes wrapped up in the language of hostility to Israel or hostility to Zionism. And it seems to me that we don't necessarily respond to that kind of anti-Semitism by a defense of Zionism and Israel. But let me give you an example. If anti-Semites come at you shouting, the Jews run the banks, and Jewish bankers have been completely irresponsible in their lending and have led to the credit crunch, and the evidence for that is Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers and the other banks within which there were many Jews. Okay? Now, our response to that is not to defend Jewish bankers. Our response to that is to say, this is an anti-Semitic narrative, and let me explain to you why. So it just seems to me quite an important... See, I very often get accused, and that is how it is. Hirsch is a pro-Israel guy who fights anti-Semitism. Right? Now, I may or may not be pro-Israel. I'm going to have that discussion a different day. I don't have to be pro or anti-Israel in order to challenge an anti-Semitic narrative. See what I mean? And it seems to me that it's rather important, because what I want to be able to do is to enable a space to have serious discussion about Israel, actually, and Israeli policy, and to have serious criticism. Howard Jacobson, people know Howard Jacobson is an author in Britain, and he says criticism. He says, I'm a literary critic. That's what I do criticism. And criticism is very important. But the thing that we're talking about isn't criticism of Israel. Right? It's hostility to Israel, it's irrational fear of Israel, it's irrational hatred of Israel. So, okay, I think I've made that point. The question to me was... Sorry. Go on, carry on.
Just because you asked a question doesn't mean you're entitled to an answer to that question. You're entitled to an answer to a different question. So we'll start on this side here with the gentleman. Just give us your name and then address your question to whichever of the professors you prefer.
Hi there. Is this on?
I hope it is.
Is it on now? Is it on now? Can people hear me if I yell?
Yes.
Well, there, now it's on, it seems to be.
Hi, I'm Rob Wagman. I'm from Toronto, and I have also one question for each. Dr. Hirsch, here in Canada, and I would think North America, we don't really have an appreciation of what it's like in Britain other than what we read from headlines in a newspaper. And the same way you analyzed the explanation of the murder in France of the French Jewish children, the rationalization seems somewhat similar to what British authorities did after the two bombings in London, and said, oh, listen, it's not really a form of terrorism. These poor guys, even though they're British born, were poor members of a opposed segment of society. The old British stiff upper lip, to my mind, bizarreness that I don't understand on this side of the pond. My question is it not incumbent upon Jews in Britain to stand up for themselves more than they have and become a little bit more politically incorrect? That's my question for Professor Hirsch. For Professor Chatterley, I went to college in one of the more snotty northeastern schools in the United States, and I graduated in the mid-70s. And when I was there was, I would say, endemic anti-Semitism, although as a Jewish student I had full abilities to do anything I wanted. My question to you is, why is it in this day and age so many intelligent academics just seem so unintelligent when it comes to anti-Israel dogma?
Okay, who would like to go first? Professor Hirsch, perhaps?
I don't know what you mean by politically incorrect. I suspect that I know what you mean by politically incorrect, and I think that if what I think you mean is what you mean, then there's a problem. I agree with the first part of what you said. I agree that Jews in Britain and elsewhere should stand up against anti-Semitism more loudly, more confidently, and more militantly than they do. I think that's correct, and if people know my work, they will know that that's what I have been doing. What I absolutely don't think is that the Jews should start some kind of communalist politics which starts blaming foreigners or people coming in from outside or people with the wrong religion or people with the wrong kind of dress or any of that stuff. Partly because I think it would be counterproductive and partly because I think it's not true.
Yeah,
to be honest,
I was referring to that.
well, I don't know what you mean by political incorrectness. What I can report to you is that the leadership of the anti-Zionist movement in Britain is largely Jewish. And I think that's a serious and significant problem. And you have to see, you know, at union conferences, it's not a surprise, right? If well-respected, well-loved Jewish intellectuals and Jewish celebrities say these people who are talking about anti-Semitism are actually just standing up for Israel and trying to delegitimize criticism, so don't listen to them. If they say that, they kind of get believed. And I think the problem on the left and the problem amongst what I've called the chattering classes isn't really to do with Muslims actually at all.
Professor Chatterley?
I think that the problem that you're talking about in academia is really reflective of the larger problem in Western culture. If you really sit and think about it, can you honestly say that non-Jews in the West have been educated about anti-Semitism? If you really sit and think, where have they learned about this? Nowhere. Nowhere. The one opportunity we had, I'm sorry to say, was after the Holocaust with Holocaust education. And in my opinion, Holocaust education has not done us well. It has been universalized. It has taught about generic hatred and the hatred of the other, and it has done nothing to teach non-Jews about anti-Semitism. And we missed our opportunity. They've learned nothing, and they know nothing. And I speak as a non-Jew, and I speak as a professor who teaches non-Jews. They don't know anything. They don't know how to recognize it. And I will tell you that one thing, I can give you a bit of optimism tonight, is that when they do learn about it, because I teach a course on the history of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, they spend 72 hours with me all year learning about this. And I don't have to explain to them that the article in a Swedish paper talking about the Israelis harvesting organs, that's a blood libel. I don't have to say it. They get it. They got it. This is medieval Europe, right? Recreated. That's what we need to do. That's what we need to do. And the academics, most of them, of course, non-Jews, they don't have any better understanding of anti-Semitism than anybody else does. They don't. This is part of, I think, the problem that David is facing in England, and we're facing it everywhere, is that people simply do not understand what anti-Semitism is. They do not see these themes. They don't even hear themselves. They're not aware of their own thinking and how it reflects anti-Semitic ways of thinking about Jews. They don't know this. It's scary. But it's very true. It's very, very true. It's why I started the Institute. This has to change. We have to do education very specifically on the problem of anti-Semitism. We have to teach non-Jews what this is, and that so many of their ideas about Jews and Israel today are reflective of this bias and this bigotry that is invisible.
Thank you.
Go on this side, please.
Yes. My question is based, or at least motivated by the chronicle of anti-Semitism given to us by the first presenter. But I'd like the answer to the question to come from you, Father D'Souza, if that's acceptable.
It's changing the rules.
The lady has given us quite a chronicle of anti-Semitism in Europe that is based primarily on Christian theology. And Christian theology, for the first 1,000 years, or 1,500 or 2,000 years, has been Catholic theology. Now, with the appearance of John Paul, the Polish Pope, we've seen the Catholic Church move great distances to near itself to their Jewish roots. In fact, the Pope referred to Judaism as our elder brother. And many of us in the Jewish community felt really we were living in historic times, and there was something happening in the Catholic Church. We've seen, for instance, in North America, the evangelical Christian community move very closely in support of Israel and make Jews feel as if we are part of a community that's being supported by a large segment of the Christian world. And yet the Catholic Church under the present Pope has become kind of constipated. It doesn't say anything when it comes to that. I wonder why. Thank you.
I'm in a conflict of interest because as moderator I could rule the question out of order and get myself off the hook, or I could answer it. What would you prefer? Before I answer it? Well, it's a very long, complicated history that Professor Chatterley spoke about, so I'm not going to address that part. It just takes too long. The question about today, say, vis-a-vis the Catholic Church or the evangelical Protestants and support for Israel or Jews, there's different things going on in different parts of the world. I think if you look at the statements of Pope Benedict, both in his scholarly writings and what he said when he meets Jewish groups or when he went to Israel, there's very little difference between the two, Pope John Paul and Pope Benedict. They have different styles, and Pope John Paul was doing things for the first time that Pope Benedict is repeating, so it doesn't have the same novelty factor, but substantially they're both the same. I would say, vis-a-vis the question we have tonight, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and so forth, vis-a-vis the state of Israel, there's a very different way of looking at Israel in the evangelical community and in the Catholic and Orthodox community. The reason is because there are very few evangelical Protestants who live in Israel or Palestine. There are just very few. There are some, but there are very few. And in the Arab world, there are almost no evangelical Protestants. However, when I go to Israel, which I go once or twice a year, whenever I meet my fellow Catholics there, they're all Palestinians. The number of Catholic Jews, or Hebrew-speaking Catholics, if you want to say, even the terminology indicates to you it's a very rare phenomenon, are very few. So one of the challenges is that for Christians who have co-religionists in the region, that would be Orthodox and Catholic, when we look at what goes on in Israel and in Palestine, all of our fellow Catholics are Palestinian Arabs, all of them. So that colors the way that we think about things or look at things. And that's why the fellows use an anatomical expression for the what he hears from us, but it'd be different in the evangelical Protestant community, which by and large looks at the situation in Israel-Palestine through a theological reading of the importance of the ingathering of the Jews to the land of Israel, but doesn't have a local church that's present there. So they have a different view. I could say much more, but I think that gives you some sense of why, from Catholic and Orthodox sources, you might hear different things. But it is true, I'll just finish with this, that in the last really 50 years, going back to the Second Vatican Council, there's been a sea change in relations between Christians and Jews, between Catholics and Jews in particular, and I think that's a laudable thing that is that's worth in otherwise a kind of sobering set of presentations tonight. It's a welcome thing to point to. Gentleman on this side.
My name is Joe Warner. I have a very short question for Professor Hirsch. How many Jews remain in South Africa today?
70,000.
How many?
70.
70,000 Jews in South Africa. Thank you. Over on this side.
I also have a question for Professor Hirsch. How successful have you been in convincing your colleagues of their flawed logic and thinking with respect to their anti-Semitic views? Or do you feel like you're beating your head against a wall sometimes and not making much progress on that?
I feel, well, I think we can claim some successes. One of the successes we can claim is that there is no boycott within my trade union of Israeli academics. There is actually a rather nasty little stalemate where the union tolerates every year a kind of hate fest at Congress, but refuses to implement any boycott because they know that they would be sued by some of our friends. So that's a part of it. It's not nothing. When we came into existence, there was a boycott in existence. So now there isn't. That's good. Secondly, what we've done is we've provided a framework, a set of ideas, a way of arguing back, and a way of fighting back, which is intellectually and politically coherent. And I think there was a problem. I think many Jews wanted to argue back and to fight back. They felt that there was a real problem with the kind of rhetoric that they were faced with, but they didn't know how. And they didn't want simply to, you know, if somebody criticizes Israel, just to defend everything that Israel does. And what I think we've done is develop a way of responding which many people have found useful, and which have kind of galvanized people and given them some confidence, and which has also been adopted by a number of different people. You know, so I think we've had some influence. The actual answer to your question is, I don't think we've changed anybody's mind, really. Very few people's minds. You know, we're arguing what we believe and we're fighting, but I believe that the atmosphere is going away from us, gently, slowly, not catastrophically, just gets a little wee bit worse every year. That's what I would say.
Gentleman on this side, please.
I'm looking again at the topic, which refers to the blurry red line. And I'm wondering whether either of you thinks that anti-Zionism is by definition anti-Semitism, or whether some forms of anti-Zionism don't cross the line and aren't anti-Semitic. So, you know, don't descend to the level of anti-Semitism. It's not clear to me in either case where you come out on that.
Did everybody hear the question? The microphone seemed to be off. The question, gentleman's question, was whether, in fact, there are forms of anti-Zionism which are not anti-Semitic, or if, by definition, one is the other, and he asked both panelists to respond.
The question of definition of anti-Semitism is a huge question, a fraught question, and a very interesting question. As a kind of easy answer to your question is yes, actually, strangely enough, the people who manage to be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic are the anarchists, because they oppose states, and they oppose all states, and they oppose the Israeli state. And I know some people quite well who are anti-Zionist, but who understand and feel anti-Semitism. A more important answer about defining is, I think, what is required to see where there's anti-Semitism and where there isn't is quite keen and educated political judgment, right? So I don't like people who define, you know, anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, or other people who define Zionism as racism or whatever. What I want to happen is for people to become educated to such an extent that they're able to make serious judgments. And I think we will all disagree. I mean, the other day I was involved in a discussion about Günter Grass and his latest quote. And there's a discussion to be had about whether it's anti-Semitic or not. But I think, firstly, the most important thing is that people accept that there is a distinction, that there is a place where rhetoric which appears to be like criticism of Israel is actually hate speech. Firstly, so we have to accept that there's a distinction, and many people fall at that hurdle. They refuse to accept there's a distinction. And then once we accept there's a distinction, we can have a discussion, a serious discussion about precisely what lies where. So I think we need a difficult process of judgment rather than simple definitional pronouncements.
This is probably one of the hardest questions that is facing scholars of anti-Semitism. It's one of the biggest debates right now. And I hope that I made clear in my paper that historically these are two separate ideologies, and they are. But of course, the anti-Zionism that we know in Europe in the 19th century and the early 20th century is not what we're seeing today. So there's a big difference. I've also hoped to have made it clear that these two phenomena have converged in a very serious way, and that it's very often that the anti-Zionism that one hears is if not, if it isn't led through the anti-Semitic themes and tropes that I've tried to illustrate, when it is, of course, we can call this out as anti-Semitism very clearly, very clearly. This is very clear, or at least it's clear to us, for people who are familiar with these tropes and themes and recognize them and understand what they mean, a kind of code, if you will. Not everybody sees that, which is the problem, but there's hope that through education one can see this. So when that is there, it is very clear. There are other examples. It's the same, for example, you know, the expansion of the definition of anti-Semitism. If you look at the EU definition produced by the European Union, Holocaust denial is a form of anti-Semitism. This is difficult because it actually does not conform to the strict historical definition that I've used tonight. It doesn't. But the difference that I would make here is that while it does not necessarily conform to the strict historical definition, what I would argue is that anti-Semitism is informing those who deny the Holocaust. If you understand what I'm saying. Is Holocaust denial a form of anti-Semitism? We can debate that if we use this strict historical definition. What I see Holocaust denial as is a function of anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism pre-exists. The only people that deny the Holocaust are anti-Semites, and there is a purpose there. One might make the argument that much of the anti-Zionism that does not even use or employ those tropes that we would recognize as anti-Semitic, that is very often a function of anti-Semitism. So whether or not it is actually anti-Semitic per se, these are some of the debates that are going on. I don't know if that's of any help at all.
Thank you. We probably have time for 2 more questions, so not everybody at the microphone will get a chance, but we'll start with the lady here on my right.
Dr. Chatterley, you referred twice to the fact that Israel Apartheid Week started in Toronto, which certainly it did at the University of Toronto and spread to York, etc., etc. I'm very ashamed of my university, and I think it's incumbent upon them to do something about this Apartheid Week that has spread around the world, certainly North America. I'm just wondering, I think that would be a way of perhaps rectifying and educating the wider population. What do you think of that?
Well, I can tell you that it's in Manitoba now too. It's been at the University of Manitoba, I believe, for 3 years, and it's been at the University of Winnipeg for 2 years. For 2 years. So I hear that it's I don't know about winding down, but I hear that it's slowing down here. I hear that. I don't know if this is true, but it's hard to measure these things anyway, right?
Well,
but this
it's spread to the United States on many campuses, and I somehow think it can be used as an education for the general population to see how this kind of nastiness, which is untrue, can spread, and maybe alert them to maybe not believe what they do. Except I don't know how to go about doing it.
Well, this is a challenge, I'll tell you. It's a challenge in Manitoba too, and the Jewish community is divided on how to deal with this as well. It's a difficult question. Does one deal with it head on? Is one confrontational? Does one offer counter-programming? Does one ignore it and not give it any media attention, and hopefully it will, if not disappear, it'll reduce in strength? So there are different approaches. But it is growing in Manitoba. It is now, this past year, it was in over 100 cities. And it started in 2005 in 1. So it is growing, there is no question. I believe that it is something to be concerned about because it is a part of a much broader movement, which is the argument that I've tried to make in Winnipeg, which is to say, this is not just about the University of Manitoba and the 10 people that go to these events. It's not well attended. And the programming is terrible, the academic quality of it. The fact of the matter is that it's part of a broader movement. It's part of the BDS movement. It is part of a worldwide, global effort to delegitimize the state of Israel and to delegitimize Zionism. That is what this is. And it is very powerful in many places. The only thing that I have suggested, I don't believe in banning anything. You're not going to have any support for that on a university campus in Canada. I think the best thing to do is to offer counter programming, high quality academic programming that does not deal with the hardcore ideologues that David is talking about, where you're not going to convince these people. You don't need to worry about them. You need to worry about my students. You need to worry about the middle, who know nothing about anything and who then are exposed to things that are not true. So I think counter programming, but again, it can't necessarily come from outside the university. You have to have organizations and faculty that will sponsor such things on campus, and that can be a challenge too, including students as well. But I think that that's really the message, is high quality academic programming that is accurate and that engages with the very difficult nature of the conflict and the history.
Okay. So our last question is this lady on the left.
Professor Chatterley, I just want to thank you for a brilliant paper. The work it takes is so much further than so much of what I've read. And what I want to ask you is, since the Christian church has been responsible for the beginnings of anti-Semitism through, up to our present time, with even the current Pope bringing back the Latin Mass, which prays for the, if I'm correct, prays for the enlightenment of the Jews and to lift the veil from their eyes, that since the church has been responsible, would it not be incumbent on the Christian church, on all branches of the Christian church, to do this education that you're talking about? That shouldn't the ministers and priests be the ones who talk about these things, who talk about what anti-Semitism is, and try and rectify and apologize for these 2,000 years of anti-Semitism?
Wonderful question. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Wouldn't that be wonderful?
I'd like a moderator.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I have very little hope of that, I'm afraid. But I couldn't agree more. I often think, too, that I see Christians who are critical of the state of Israel, that's fine. Critical of policies, that's fine. Even harshly critical, for that matter. And very fierce in their defense of the Palestinian cause, that's fine too. But when you have Christians engaging in the efforts of delegitimation and denying the Jewish identity of the state, extremely problematic given this history, as it is the same way that it is when I see Germans of any faith, the French. I mean, I personally, as a historian of Europe, I will tell you that I really feel it's incumbent on Europeans to also put an end to the global delegitimation of the Jewish state. As far as, let me just say one word, I wasn't going to say anything, but I will now that I have the mic. I want to make one distinction between the two popes. I was raised in the Lutheran Church, actually, and I, for the life of me, could not believe that the Catholic Church would make a man pope who had been in the Hitler Youth, however young and perhaps coerced into this, given the context of the time. But the fact that this man was in the Hitler Youth, I do, for John Paul's sake, I want to make a distinction. There's a huge difference between these popes.
So I want to, on behalf of our sponsors tonight, thank you for your participation. Our sponsors are the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs and the UJA Federation of Greater Toronto. Our host here tonight, Rabbi Baruch Friedman Cole, welcomed us, and I thank you for his welcome. Above all, to our two guests, one of whom came from Winnipeg, which is a fair distance. The other one came from London, which is a greater distance. So we thank them both, Professor Chatterley and Professor Cole. And
one question?
No, I think we were doing the thank you, sir. So You're welcome to talk to them afterwards, but we've come to the end, which we promised that we'd have everybody finished. The refreshments are at the back, if you'd like to stay. Thank you very much.